as backwards people, not as the elite or the more positive minds of the culture. In fact, what we see in India is we see the more backward religious elements of the American culture coming to India. Not the more, whereas the more spiritual minds in Western culture are going more towards the Eastern culture, towards the Hindu tradition, yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism, even the Chinese tradition, but not to this type of evangelical Christianity that you see coming to India, and not to this Catholic tradition which you also see coming to India. A few years ago in Hyderabad, I had a debate with the Archbishop of Hyderabad, the Archbishop Arulappa, on the issue of conversions in India. And I raised the point that conversion is not necessary. In fact, conversion is really a sin against God. Conversion is not recognizing that God dwells in all of us. God dwells in each person. When you try to turn someone into a Christian, when you try to take away their native beliefs and make them into something else, you are denying the divine self that is already within them. So it's very important that we respect the divine presence in all beings, and we honor all the traditions that we have on the planet. All the spiritual, native, religious, indigenous, and cultural traditions. We have many wonderful traditions all over the planet, and they are not limited to any particular faith. They are not limited to any particular region. But at the same time, I think we find more of these in India today than we do in any other country. And I think historically, there has been more in India than in any other country. In fact, you may wonder, in India there are so many gurus, so many saints, so many sages throughout the centuries and in every generation. So you may wonder why in the Western world there's only talk of this one guy who lived 2,000 years ago. And nothing or very little has happened in between. And one of the answers for that is the strength of the Hindu culture. Because the Hindu culture is primarily a spiritual culture. It's a culture of devotion. It is a culture of puja. It is a culture of worship. It is a culture of yoga. It is a culture of meditation. And of course, it is a culture of dharma. And this culture needs to be preserved. This culture needs to be spread. It needs to be preserved not only in India, it needs to be spread to the rest of the world. Because even though you'll find throughout the rest of the world there are many different cultures that have many wonderful things in them, the greater portion of the spiritual heritage of humanity has been carried in India, has been carried in this country. This is your heritage, but it's also your heritage to share with the rest of the world and with the entire planet. And one of the unfortunate things is with the centuries of foreign rule, with the Islamic invasion, with the British rule, with the coming of all the missionaries, there is this sense by many Hindus that their culture is inferior, or their culture is not relevant, or their culture is something they should feel ashamed about, rather than something they should be proud of and share with other people. Over a century ago, Swami Vivekananda went to the West, and he proclaimed the positive value of the Hindu tradition, of Vedas, and of yoga. And he began an entire Western yoga movement that was totally unexpected and unheard of, and which, of course, the missionaries were very unhappy with. And all he did is he took the fundamental values and approaches of Hindu culture and he put them in a more understandable English form and was willing to share them with people all over the world. And we see this even today in the West, that Hindu ideas are very popular and very trendy if they're packaged a certain way. Now, there is some distortion of Hindu culture in the West. I don't mean to say it's all good. A lot of the yoga that we see in the West is a more physically based yoga as opposed to a spiritual based yoga. But there is a movement towards the spiritual aspect of Hindu culture, and it is moving more into the Western world and affecting it in a positive way. In fact, most of the new ideas that we see in the Western world relative to healing, relative to psychology, relative to meditation, spirituality, what is called New Age thought, can be traced to teachers and ideas coming out of India. In fact, it's estimated that about 1/4 of the population of the United States believes in karma and rebirth, even though they may not formally call themselves Hindu. However, in India, another movement has also happened since the independence of the country and even before. A lot of the most anti-Hindu thinkers come out of India itself. And many of them write prominently for the major newspapers and magazines inside of India. And many of them have prominent Hindu names. So the unfortunate thing that happened in India is that many of the intellectuals of the country went after the Western way of thought, particularly this Marxist and communist way of thinking, and never had any roots, never had any real foundation in Hindu culture. And they portray Hindu culture in a very negative light. The other thing we've seen in modern India is modern India has created itself as a secular state. And there's nothing essentially wrong with that. A state should be beyond any religious dogma, identity, or bias. But in the process, there's been an almost anti-Hindu attitude that has come out of many people in the government and in the media, or an attitude that a minority religion must be better, or the Hindu religion must be criticized, or it must be taxed, it must be treated in a negative way, because that is the majority religion. In fact, India is a very unusual country in this regard. India is perhaps the only country where the majority religion is attacked by the media and the minority religions are defended. There are so many examples of that, and of course, you see that every day. There's also the idea that the Hindu tradition should have no social or political voice, that it's all fine if it reduces itself or keeps itself on the level of spirituality alone. But Hindus should not come into the social system. They should not enter into the political arena. The Hindu voice should not be there in the social world. This is also not the Hindu tradition, and it is another way of keeping this tradition down. There is a very important Kshatriya Dharma in the Hindu tradition. There's a very important social Dharma. There's a very important ethical voice in the Hindu tradition. There is a concern with raising up society. There is a concern with developing a social order that is dharmic. There is a concern with developing this Rama Rajya on earth. And this dharmic aspect of Hinduism is very important. And unless this dharmic aspect of Hinduism enters into the Indian social and political scene, I don't think there will be any real transformation in this country. This doesn't mean that Hinduism as a dogma or religion must be enforced in the schools. It means that pride in Dharma and pride in the Hindu tradition as the national heritage of this country should be there for everyone. One of the most important aspects of culture is history. Each culture has its history. India has its history. It didn't begin in 1947. It wasn't created by the British. This whole idea of Bharata, this whole idea of Indian culture, or Bharatiya Sanskriti, goes back to Mahabharata. It goes back to the Vedas themselves. So to reclaim your culture, it's very important that you reclaim your history. The true history of India was not written by Max Muller. It was not written by Pandit Nehru. It was not written by the Marxist scholars. There are Hindu sources in Vedas and Puranas, and the Hindu view of history is not a social and political view of materialism. It is a history of great yogis, saints, and sages. It is a history of great kings who renounced the world, not of great kings who had to conquer the world. And so in India there is this debate about the rewriting of history. It's very important that the history here is rewritten in the light of Dharma and in the light of truth and in respect for the ancient wisdom of this country. And this also means that we must change our idea of who we are as human beings. As human beings, we are all descendants of the great yogis and rishis. The rishi heritage belongs to all of us, and the purpose of true culture is union with the divine and self-realization. A culture that aims at consumerism is not a culture of the spirit. It is not a true culture. It cannot truly uplift the mind and the heart. Ultimately, the consumer himself or herself will be consumed. Because these are values that destroy, that eat up, that take apart. Whereas true values, higher values, create, synthesize, integrate, and transform. Thank you. So it is that history of our spiritual being that we must recognize. And the history that goes back to the eternal, which is not simply rooted in time, but takes us beyond time. One famous Western intellectual once said that history is a nightmare that we're trying to wake up from. We could also say that history is our record of our separation from divinity. So we must understand our spiritual history, which is our history of spiritual aspiration. And we must once more make culture a vehicle of worship, not simply a form of ego-based expression. Western culture glorifies the ego, the body identity, the personal identity. In fact, it used to be that just the head of the family had to achieve. Now in the West, everybody has to achieve. Each person has to have their own bank account, their own job, their own fame, their own success, the husband, the wife, the children, the grandparents. As a result, the society is falling apart because there's no common sense of oneness. There's no sense of achievement for the culture, the family, the tradition as a whole. So this type of individualism is not true individualism. It is the culture of the ego, not of the higher self. The higher self, the Atma, finds happiness in the happiness of all, not just in one's personal happiness and achievement. True individuality is being one with all. It is not being separate for yourself. True culture is not a culture of entertainment where you find happiness outside yourself. It is a culture of self-realization where you find happiness inside yourself. The ultimate technology of happiness is not a bigger television, a bigger movie, a better computer, a better DVD, a faster car, a better helicopter, airplane, or whatever it is. The true technology of Ananda is the practice of yoga, is the technology of yoga through mantra, through meditation, through the worship of the devatas, through bhakti, jnana, kriya yoga, through raja yoga. That is the internal way of achieving lasting happiness. All these outer forms of happiness that we look for are transient. And the other rule is any outward form of happiness is going to be very expensive. Going to be very expensive. And that is what we're pioneering in the Western world. More and more expensive forms of getting the happiness which is naturally yours and you should have for free. No happiness that comes from the outside can equal the happiness that comes from the inside. Recently they did a survey of the different countries of the world asking people who was the most happy. And they found that people in poorer countries like India had a higher happiness index than people in wealthier countries like the United States and Europe. And of course, part of the reason for this is that consumerism must keep you unhappy, because then you won't be willing to, then you will always be willing to buy something new. A happy person is not a good consumer, because a happy person does not need all these external things. Now, Hindu culture has practices and values that must be maintained. The different samskaras are very important ways of developing culture, character, and personality. The different social practices, the rituals, the seasonal practices, the holy days, the holidays, the festivals, are also very important vehicles of culture, because culture is also a movement through time. There is still the humility, there is still the presence of the human being, and he awakens each person to their own divinity rather than making everybody else bow down to his divinity. He shares his divinity with all. He awakens the divinity within all. That is his true greatness. And I think you cannot find a better representative of Hindu culture. And he has created a format here through this event for showing so much of Hindu culture. And of course, so much of Hindu culture is in a field which I can't claim much knowledge of, which is the music and the dance. But it is also very important and very key to the survival of the culture. So I think we are all honored and blessed to be here. It is my hope that this Hindu culture can spread and grow, that such events can be used as a vehicle for this. And I do hope that people from all over India follow the inspiration of Guruji, take up his message, and also bring this wisdom to the rest of the world, to the Western world. Even though many gurus come to the West, very few great gurus come to the West. And unfortunately, most people in the West are not able to discriminate the great gurus from the ordinary gurus, because of course we in the West are still so much dominated by the media or the Maya that we tend to go after the money and the appearances. But the essence is something more than that. The pure Brahman, the Satchitananda, is always something more than Maya. We must understand Maya, but we must look beyond Maya. We must understand how to approach Maya in a dharmic way, how to live in this world of Maya in a dharmic way. But at the same time, we must have some vision, something more. And the Hindu culture shows us how to go beyond Maya. It shows us how Maya develops all the different forms, but it shows us something more. So it has been my honor to speak to you here today. I am happy that you have sat through my very long and rambling lecture. I have covered many topics because I have dealt with a topic that, of course, has many sides that can be seen in a different way. If anything I have said has been of value, it is because I have tried to reflect back to you what I have discovered in this Vedic tradition. I have tried to take the time to understand the Vedas, Upanishads, Mahabharata, etc. As Guruji said, from the inside, not from the outside. All these teachings dwell within you. They are part of your own heart and mind. You must approach them from within in order to really understand them. So take them up as your own inner heritage, as coming to you from within, as the teaching of your own inner voice, and reflect that to the greater world. This program today started with there was an Agni, a fire, that was brought out in the traditional way through rubbing the fire sticks or the aranis. That Agni symbolizes the divine presence in all of us. Each person has an Agni, a flame that dwells in the heart. So in bringing back this Vedic wisdom and in spreading this Hindu culture, we must awaken that flame of Agni in our own hearts, and we must share that flame of Agni. We must use the light of our own Agni to light and enlighten the minds and hearts of all people. It is my hope that you all do that, and that we can share that Agni and live in that Agni and keep this Vedic inspiration alive through another generation and renew the Rishi heritage, the Rishi culture, and bring it out to the greater world as a whole. Thank you.
పండిట్ రామదేవ శాస్త్రి గారి ఉపన్యాసం మీరంతా విన్నారు. 5 గంటలకి అని చెప్పి ప్రింట్ చేసి అందరికీ డిస్ట్రిబ్యూట్ చేసిన మన వాళ్ళే 5:45కి వచ్చారు కొందరు. డెఫినెట్గా కొంత ఇలాంటి సీరియస్గా తీసుకుంటేనే మనం ఇంత దూరం నుంచి వచ్చి ఆయన మాట్లాడిన తర్వాత అందులో కొన్ని విషయాలు మనం గ్రహించి తీరాలి. లోకల్ అండ్ యూనివర్సల్ అని 2 మాటలు వాడారు ఆయన. అంటే అర్థం ఏమిటంటే విశ్వవ్యాప్తమైనటువంటి ఒక భావనలో ఉండి ఒక చిన్న స్థానంలో ఒక వస్తువుతో సంబంధం పెట్టుకోగలిగి ఉండటం. ఉదాహరణకి చిన్న మహాలక్ష్మి విగ్రహం ఒక అంగుళం ఎత్తు ఉంటుంది. అది పెట్టుకుని మనం పూజ చేస్తాము. నీవు పూజ చేస్తున్న ఈ అంగుళం ఎత్తున్నటువంటి వెండి మహాలక్ష్మి బొమ్మ ఉందే, ఇది ఎవరు అని అడిగితే సృష్టి అంతా వ్యాపించిన చైతన్యం అని చెప్తాం మనం. అదన్నమాట. దట్స్ వెన్ హీ మెంట్ యూ షుడ్ బి యూనివర్సల్ ఇన్ యువర్ కాన్షియస్నెస్ బట్ బి లోకలైజ్డ్ ఇన్ యువర్ అప్రోచ్ టు ఇట్. Worship Mahalakshmi, the idol is only 1 inch tall, but you are worshipping Mahalakshmi that pervades the entire creation. That is life, that is sustenance, that's our wealth, that is our health, that's our wisdom, ultimately deliverance. Everything is Mahalakshmi. The approach to the whole through a small, localized symbol is the Hindu culture. That's what he meant. So every sentence that he said contains a very deep sense and a message, and I thank Pandit Vamadeva Shastri, Dr. Frawley, for having taken the trouble of explaining the current trends, the past, with an advice for the future to every one of us. I hope you would be able to come again and again and address us. Thank you.
ఇంకా కొద్ది క్షణాల్లో ఇక్కడ గురుతత్వ వైజయంతి అనే